When we think about World War I, we picture the dramatic moments. The Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers climbed out of their trenches to shake hands and play football in no man's land. The horror of gas attacks, men choking on chlorine and mustard gas, clawing at their throats as their lungs dissolved. The mass charges over the top, thousands of men climbing ladders and running into machine gun fire that cut them down like wheat before a scythe. The mud of Passchendaele, so deep it swallowed men whole, drowning them in liquid earth while their comrades watched helplessly. These are the images that define the Great War in popular memory. The big moments, the dramatic turning points, the atrocities that shocked the world and changed warfare forever. But here's what gets lost in those dramatic retellings, what the documentaries skip over in their rush to get to the next battle, what the history books gloss over because it's too mundane to hold readers' attention. Between those moments of terror and violence, between the charges and the bombardments and the gas attacks, there were days, weeks, months, long stretches of time when nothing dramatic happened at all, when soldiers didn't fight, when they didn't die gloriously or heroically or even particularly violently, when they just existed, in trenches, in mud, in cold, in boredom so crushing and monotonous that men would have welcomed a battle just for something, anything, to break the routine. The Western Front stretched for over 400 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Along that entire length, millions of men lived in an underground world of trenches, dugouts, tunnels, and fortifications. They lived there for 4 years. 4 years of sitting in the same positions, staring at the same stretches of devastated landscape, watching the same enemy positions that never seemed to get any closer or farther away, no matter how many attacks were launched. 4 years of waiting, 4 years of routine. 4 years of the most boring, tedious, uncomfortable, physically miserable existence imaginable, punctuated by brief moments of absolute terror. This is the story of what daily life was actually like for a World War I soldier. Not the battles, not the dramatic moments that made it into the history books, but the reality. The boring, grinding, soul-crushing reality of trench warfare. The lice, the rats, the mud, the cold, the terrible food, the constant minor discomforts that accumulated into genuine suffering. The boredom so profound it drove men to take insane risks just to feel something other than crushing monotony. The strange routines and rituals that developed in this underground world. The ways men tried to maintain their humanity while living in conditions that seemed designed to strip it away. Because once you understand the daily reality, once you see past the dramatic moments to the grinding tedium underneath, you understand World War I in a way the battle narratives never convey. You understand why men broke, why shell shock became epidemic, why mutinies erupted, why soldiers on both sides developed a strange kind of respect, even sympathy, for the enemy soldiers trapped in the same miserable conditions just a few hundred yards away. You understand that the Great War wasn't just fought in the dramatic charges and bombardments. It was fought every single day, in a million small acts of endurance, in the sheer stubborn refusal to give up even when every rational calculation said continuing was pointless. This is that story, the unglamorous one, the one that doesn't make for dramatic movie scenes or inspiring memorial speeches. The story of what it was actually like to live through the First World War, one miserable day at a time. The Western Front wasn't a line, not really. It was a vast complex of parallel trenches, communication trenches connecting them, support trenches behind them, reserve trenches farther back, all connected by a labyrinth of passages that snaked through the earth like blood vessels through tissue. The frontline trench, where soldiers actually faced the enemy, was just the visible edge of an enormous underground infrastructure that extended miles behind the lines. From above, if you could somehow hover over the battlefield and see through the smoke and devastation, the trench systems looked almost organic. They zigzagged, curved, branched, and reconnected in patterns that seemed random, but were actually carefully designed. Trenches didn't run straight because a single enemy soldier with a machine gun at one end of a straight trench could kill everyone in it. So they curved and angled, creating a series of short offset segments called traverses. An explosion or machine gun burst might kill everyone in one traverse, but it couldn't sweep the entire length of the trench. The trenches themselves varied enormously in quality depending on location, soil conditions, available resources, and how long they'd been occupied. The best trenches, often found in chalk soils that drained well, could be quite sophisticated. They had proper duckboards, raised wooden walkways that kept soldiers' feet above the water that inevitably accumulated at the bottom. They had fire steps, raised platforms that allowed soldiers to stand and shoot over the parapet. They had deep dugouts, underground rooms carved into the trench walls where men could shelter from bombardment. Some of these dugouts were quite elaborate, 15 or 20 feet underground, reinforced with timber, equipped with bunks, stoves, even electric lighting if power could be brought forward. The worst trenches, found in clay soils or low-lying areas with poor drainage, were nightmares. Constant wetness made the walls collapse regularly, the bottom filled with thick, clinging mud that could be waist deep in the worst sections. Soldiers stood in this mud for hours, sometimes days, until their feet swelled and the flesh began to rot, a condition called trench foot that could lead to gangrene and amputation. These trenches had no proper dugouts, just shallow scrapes in the walls that offered minimal protection from shells. They smelled terrible, a thick stench of human waste, rotting sandbags, decay, and death that permeated everything. No man's land, the strip of devastated ground between the opposing trench systems, varied in width from as little as 25 yards in some sectors to several hundred yards in others. It was perhaps the most dangerous piece of real estate in human history. Utterly lifeless, cratered by shells, tangled with barbed wire, littered with the dead from previous attacks, it was watched constantly by machine guns and snipers on both sides. Nothing moved out there during daylight without being shot at. Even at night, it was illuminated regularly by star shells, flares that lit up the darkness like artificial daylight, freezing anyone caught in the open and making them perfect targets. The dead lay out in no man's land because retrieving bodies was too dangerous. They just stayed there, slowly decomposing, becoming part of the landscape. After months or years, the trenches were surrounded by the partially decomposed remains of men who died trying to cross that impossible space. Sometimes body parts were incorporated into the trench walls themselves, sticking out of the mud, impossible to remove without collapsing the wall, so soldiers just left them there and tried not to think about whose hand or foot that was poking through the earth next to them. Behind the front line, trenches stretched the support and reserve systems. Support trenches, a few hundred yards back, held soldiers waiting to reinforce the front or rotate in when the front-line troops were relieved. Reserve trenches, farther back still, held larger groups of soldiers waiting for major attacks or defending against breakthrough attempts. Communication trenches running perpendicular to the main trench lines connected all these systems and allowed movement of troops, supplies, wounded, and messages without exposing men to enemy fire. This entire underground city was maintained by constant labor. Trenches collapsed regularly, especially after bombardments or heavy rain. Duckboards rotted and had to be replaced. Drainage ditches needed constant cleaning. Sandbags, the primary building material, deteriorated quickly and needed replacing every few months. Barbed wire in front of the trenches needed constant repair and reinforcement. It was never-ending work, exhausting physical labor done while under threat of enemy fire, in all weather, regardless of how tired or sick the soldiers were. The Germans, having been on the defensive for most of the war, after their initial advance was stopped, built the best trenches. They had time to construct deep, well-engineered systems. Their dugouts were famous, some as deep as 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete and steel. Virtually immune to anything except a direct hit from the heaviest shells. They had electric lighting, proper ventilation, bunks, stoves, storage for supplies. Some German dugouts even had wallpaper, pictures, furniture salvaged from ruined houses, almost home-like in their appointments. This wasn't luxury, it was practicality. The Germans understood they might be occupying these positions for years and built accordingly. The British and French trenches, were generally less sophisticated, especially in the early years. British military doctrine initially held that trenches were temporary, that the war would become mobile again soon, that building elaborate fortifications suggested defeatism. So British soldiers often occupied poorly constructed trenches with minimal drainage, shallow dugouts that offered little protection and inadequate sanitation. It wasn't until later in the war, when it became clear the trenches were permanent, that British positions improved significantly. French trenches varied enormously depending on sector and circumstance. In some areas, particularly in the Champagne region, the chalk soil allowed for excellent drainage and deep excavation, and French positions were quite good. In other areas, particularly the low-lying regions near rivers, French trenches were cesspools of mud and water. French soldiers suffered terribly in these conditions, and their casualty rates from disease and non-combat causes reflected the misery of their accommodations. The Americans, arriving late in the war, initially occupied French and British trenches before constructing their own. American engineering expertise and industrial capacity meant that when they did build trenches, they were often quite good, but the Americans never occupied the trenches long enough to experience the full grinding misery of years-long trench warfare the way the other combatants did. Living in this underground world required adaptation. Soldiers developed an almost mole-like existence, spending most of their time below ground, emerging only when necessary for duty. They slept in dugouts during the day when bombardment was heaviest, worked at night under cover of darkness. They learned to navigate the maze of trenches by feel in complete darkness because lights attracted sniper fire and artillery. They developed an intimate knowledge of their sector. Every traverse, every dugout entrance, every drainage ditch, every spot where the walls were weak and likely to collapse. They also developed a strange kind of ownership over their section of trench. Men took pride in maintaining their bit of the line, in keeping it as clean and well constructed as possible under the circumstances. They gave names to different sections, often darkly humorous. Piccadilly Circus, Hellfire Corner, Dead Man's Alley. These names appeared on improvised signs, creating the surreal impression of a twisted underground city. And in a way, that's what it was. A city where millions of men lived, worked, suffered, and died underground in the mud for 4 years. The routine of trench life followed a daily pattern that was remarkably consistent across the entire Western Front, regardless of nationality. This routine was so ingrained, so fundamental to existence in the trenches, that it became almost ritualistic. Men could predict with reasonable accuracy what they'd be doing at any given hour of the day, barring major attacks or bombardments. This predictability was both comforting and maddening. It provided structure in an environment of chaos, but it also highlighted the monotony, the sense that nothing ever changed, that today was exactly like yesterday, and tomorrow would be exactly the same. The day began before dawn with stand to, short for stand to arms. This was the most dangerous time of day. In the pre-dawn darkness, visibility was poor, and attacks often came during these twilight hours. So every soldier in the front-line trenches was required to be awake, armed, and at his post, standing on the fire step with his rifle ready, staring out into no man's land, waiting to see if the enemy was coming. Stand 2 was cold, tense, and exhausting, especially for men who'd been on sentry duty during the night and hadn't slept. They stood there, weapons ready, peering into the gradually lightening darkness, seeing shapes that might be enemy soldiers or might just be the tortured landscape of no man's land, playing tricks on tired eyes. Officers and sergeants walked the trenches during stand 2, making sure everyone was alert, awake, and ready. Anyone caught sleeping during stand 2 faced punishment, because sleeping sentries endangered everyone. As the sky brightened and it became clear no attack was coming, stand 2 would be called off. This didn't mean relaxation, it meant breakfast, and in the trenches, breakfast was an event, one of the few moments of the day that offered something approaching pleasure, or at least distraction from misery. Breakfast was usually tea, bread, and whatever else could be scrounged, or had arrived with the ration party during the night. British soldiers were famous for their tea consumption, and it was more than just a cultural stereotype. Tea was hot, which was crucial in the constant cold and damp of the trenches. It contained caffeine, which helped men stay alert. and the ritual of making and drinking tea provided a brief moment of normalcy, a connection to home and civilian life. British soldiers brewed tea constantly in billy cans heated over small fires or portable stoves, sharing it around, using it to warm their hands as much as their bellies. The tea itself was terrible by any reasonable standard. It was made from tea leaves that had been sitting in sandbags for weeks, brewed in water that had been carried forward in petrol cans that hadn't been cleaned properly, so the tea tasted of petroleum. It was heavily sugared and often mixed with condensed milk, creating a thick, sweet, oily concoction that bore only a passing resemblance to actual tea, but it was hot, and in the trenches, hot meant everything. Bread came up with the rations, usually a day or two old by the time it reached the front lines. It was often moldy, especially in wet weather. Soldiers would cut off the moldy parts and eat the rest, sometimes toasting it over a fire to make it more palatable. Sometimes there was jam, plum, and apple jam that came in tins and was so common, so monotonously present, that soldiers grew to hate it even as they ate it because there was nothing else. German soldiers had their ersatz coffee, a substitute made from roasted acorns, chicory, or other materials, because actual coffee was blockaded and unavailable. It was bitter, weak, and unsatisfying, but like British tea, it was hot and contained some caffeine. German rations included black bread, heavy, dense, and increasingly made from inferior grains as the British naval blockade tightened and food shortages worsened in Germany. French soldiers drank their pinard, rough red wine that was part of their daily rations. The French military believed wine was essential for morale and health, and soldiers received a quarter litre of wine daily, increased to half a litre in 1916. It wasn't good wine, it was the cheapest, roughest wine available, but it was alcohol, and in the misery of the trenches, even bad wine was welcome. After breakfast came inspection. Officers and sergeants walked the trenches, checking that weapons were clean, that soldiers were properly dressed, that equipment was in good order. This might seem absurd given the conditions, but military discipline was maintained rigorously. A rusty rifle could jam at a critical moment, killing not just its owner, but potentially endangering everyone around him. Discipline, routine, and order were weapons against the chaos and horror of trench warfare. They maintained unit cohesion and gave soldiers something to focus on other than their misery. Following inspection came the daily work assignments. This was when the real labor of trench maintenance began. Men were divided into work parties, each assigned specific tasks that needed completing. Some repaired damaged sections of trench wall, filling sandbags and stacking them to replace walls that had collapsed during the night. Some cleared drainage ditches, scooping out accumulated mud and water to prevent the trenches from flooding. Some reinforced the parapet, the front wall of the trench that faced the enemy, adding sandbags and repairing damage from shell fire. Other men went out into no man's land, but only at night when darkness provided some protection. They repaired or strengthened barbed wire entanglements, adding new coils, replacing sections that had been destroyed by artillery. This was dangerous, nerve-wracking work. You were exposed out in the open, within easy range of enemy machine guns. Any noise might bring a burst of fire. Flares would suddenly illuminate the landscape, and you'd freeze, absolutely motionless, hoping the enemy sentries would think you were just another corpse among the many that littered no man's land. The work was exhausting, physically brutal. Filling sandbags doesn't sound difficult, but do it for hours, hundreds of sandbags, lifting and stacking them while standing in mud that sucked at your boots, while rain poured down or sun beat down, while shells occasionally screamed overhead, and it became agony. Your back ached, your hands blistered and bled, your muscles screamed. But the work continued because if it didn't, the trenches would collapse and men would die. Work parties also carried supplies forward from the support trenches. Rations, ammunition, water, duckboards, sandbags, wire, tools, all had to be hauled through the communication trenches to the front line. This meant navigating narrow, muddy passages while carrying heavy loads, often at night, sometimes under shell fire. Men formed human. Chains passing items hand to hand, or hauled materials on sledges or makeshift stretchers. It was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. Around midday came dinner, the main meal. though calling it a meal was generous. The food that reached the front-line trenches was, by any standard, terrible. It had been cooked miles behind the lines, transported forward in containers that were rarely properly cleaned, and had often gone cold or been contaminated by the time it arrived. The quality of food varied by army and deteriorated as the war progressed, especially for the Germans, whose country was being slowly starved by the British blockade. British soldiers received bully beef, corned beef that came in tins and was universally despised. It was fatty, salty, and had a distinctly metallic taste from the cans. It could be eaten cold, which was often necessary because cooking facilities in the front-line trenches were limited and fires attracted attention. Sometimes it was heated in billy cans, creating a greasy stew that at least had the virtue of being hot. They also received makanoshis, a canned meat and vegetable stew that was supposed to be nutritious and filling. It wasn't. It was a thin, watery mixture with bits of fatty meat, turnips and potatoes, all floating in a greasy liquid. When heated, it was barely tolerable. When eaten cold, which was common, it was revolting. Soldiers described it as tasting like dog food, and that was being charitable. Hard biscuits, rock-hard squares that could break teeth if you tried to bite them directly, were standard issue. They were supposed to be softened in tea or stew before eating, but soldiers often just gnawed on them, slowly working through the concrete-like texture. The biscuits were so hard, they became the subject of countless jokes and complaints. Soldiers claimed you could use them as building materials, that they could stop bullets, that they had been manufactured during the Napoleonic Wars and had been in storage ever since. German rations declined dramatically as the war progressed. Early in the war, German soldiers ate reasonably well, but the British naval blockade strangled German food supplies. By 1917 and 1918, German soldiers were receiving turnip soup, bread made partially from sawdust, ersatz foods made from substitute ingredients that tasted terrible and provided minimal nutrition. Potatoes, when available, were a treat. Meat became rare. German soldiers were slowly starving, and this affected their combat effectiveness more than any tactical innovation by the Allies. French soldiers fared somewhat better, at least in terms of food quality. French cuisine and cultural attitudes toward food meant that even military rations received more attention than in other armies. The French received better bread, though often stale by the time it reached the front. They had their pinard, their wine ration. They sometimes received cheese, sausage, coffee, chocolate, but quantity was often inadequate. And like soldiers of all armies, French poilus frequently went hungry, especially during offensives when supply lines were disrupted. Water was another constant problem. Fresh water had to be brought forward in cans, often the same petrol cans used for fuel, which meant the water tasted of petroleum. Soldiers learned to live with this taste, but it never stopped being unpleasant. The water was often contaminated despite efforts at purification. Dysentery was common, a miserable condition that left men weak, dehydrated, and unable to perform their duties. Cholera outbreaks occurred occasionally, though less frequently than in previous wars, thanks to improved sanitation practices. Drinking water from shell holes was forbidden, but happened anyway when men were desperately thirsty. Those stagnant pools, filled with rainwater and contaminated with all manner of filth, were disease incubators. But soldiers caught in no man's land during an attack, surrounded by enemy fire, unable to move, might lie in a shell hole for hours or even days. Eventually, thirst overcame caution, and they drank. Many died from the diseases they contracted as a result. After dinner came more work. The trenches always needed more labor, more sandbags to fill, more walls to repair, more wire to string. It never ended. But afternoon work was often lighter than morning work, allowing men some rest before the evening stand too. Afternoon was also when mail arrived, if there was any. Mail call was one of the most important events in trench life. Letters from home were treasured, read and reread until they fell apart. They were connections to the world outside the trenches, reminders that life continued somewhere, that families and friends still existed beyond the mud and death. The arrival of a letter could lift a soldier's spirits for days. The absence of mail, especially if it had been weeks without word from home, could send a man into deep depression. Soldiers wrote back constantly. They wrote letters home describing their experiences, though they were careful about what they said. Military censors read all outgoing mail, and anything deemed harmful to morale or useful to the enemy was cut out, leaving letters with literal holes where sensitive information had been removed. So soldiers developed a kind of code, writing cheerfully about conditions that were actually terrible, reassuring families that they were fine when they were miserable, keeping up the pretense that the war was bearable. Some soldiers kept diaries, though this was technically forbidden because diaries captured by the enemy could provide intelligence. But many men wrote anyway, recording their experiences, their thoughts, their observations. These diaries, many of which survived, provide some of the most valuable first-hand accounts of trench life. They're often heartbreaking, tracking the gradual erosion of hope, the accumulation of losses, the slow realization that the war might never end. Late afternoon brought evening stand to, another hour of heightened alertness as dusk approached. Again, every man stood on the fire step, weapon ready, watching no man's land as the light faded. Attacks often came at dusk when visibility was poor, but there was still enough light to see. So soldiers stood and waited, tense, exhausted, hoping the enemy would stay in their trenches tonight, that they wouldn't have to fight, that they could just survive another day. When stand 2 ended, dinner was served, usually similar to the midday meal or just tea and bread. Then came the night routine, which was entirely different from the day. Night was when real activity happened. The trenches came alive after dark. Work parties went out into no man's land to repair wire, lay mines, bring in wounded who'd been lying out there since the last attack. Ration parties moved forward from the rear, bringing food, water, ammunition. Patrols ventured into no man's land, crawling through the mud and wire to gather intelligence, probe enemy positions, occasionally raid enemy trenches. Night was also when relief happened. Units rotated through different sections of the trench system on a regular schedule, usually spending a few days in the front line, then moving back to support trenches, then to reserve trenches, then finally to rest areas miles behind the lines. Relief meant being replaced by fresh troops who would take over your position while you moved back. It meant walking through dark communication trenches, often under shell fire, carrying all your equipment, exhausted, covered in mud, desperately hoping you'd make it to the rear without being killed by a random shell on your way out. And then, for those who survived the day, came sleep, if you could sleep, which was never guaranteed. The trenches were too noisy, too uncomfortable, too dangerous for restful sleep. Men slept in snatches, a few hours here and there, always alert, always ready to wake instantly if shells started falling or if the alarm was raised. Sleep was precious, desperately needed, and yet often impossible. The exhaustion accumulated day after day until men functioned in a fog of fatigue. Their reactions slowed, their thinking muddled, their ability to cope with stress diminished. This routine repeated day after day. The same schedule, the same tasks, the same terrible food, the same discomforts, for weeks, for months, for some soldiers, for years. It was mind-numbing in its repetitiveness, and yet it could never be taken for granted because at any moment, without warning, a shell might land directly in your trench and kill everyone around you, or an attack might start and you'd have to fight, or you might be selected for a trench raid and have to crawl into no man's land, knowing you'd probably die. The routine was simultaneously boring and terrifying, monotonous and lethal. It was unlike any military experience in history, a strange hybrid of waiting and violence, of boredom and horror that broke men in ways traditional combat never had. If the routine was grinding, the physical conditions were genuinely horrific. Soldiers didn't just live in the trenches. They lived with the accumulated filth, decay, and biological consequences of millions of men occupying the same ground for years. The trenches were ecosystems of misery, breeding grounds for disease, parasites, and infections that made life a constant low-grade torture, even when nobody was shooting. Let's start with the mud. Not ordinary mud, trench mud. Particularly in Flanders, the region of Belgium where much of the British fighting occurred, the soil was clay, And clay plus rain plus the constant churning of millions of boots, thousands of horses, and endless shell fire created a sticky, clinging, impossible substance that dominated existence. This mud wasn't just wet dirt. It was thick, heavy, and adhesive. It stuck to everything. It coated uniforms, weapons, equipment. It worked its way into every seam, every pocket, every crevice. It got into food, water, bedding. You couldn't escape it. You stood in it, walked through it, slept beside it, ate food that had touched it. It was omnipresent, and it was deep. In the worst sectors, particularly in the Ypres salient, the mud could be waist deep. Men and horses drowned in it, not during attacks, just during regular movement through the trenches. You'd step off a duckboard, miss your footing, and sink. The mud would grip you, holding you fast. If you were alone, you might struggle for hours, exhausting yourself, slowly sinking deeper. If you were lucky, someone would find you and pull you out, which required multiple men hauling on ropes because the mud suction was tremendous. If you were unlucky, you died there, slowly suffocated by mud, and your body became part of the landscape. There are accounts, terrible accounts, of men stuck in mud within sight of their own trenches, close enough that their comrades could hear them screaming for help, but unable to reach them because crossing the open ground would mean certain death from enemy fire. So soldiers watched and listened as men slowly sank, gradually silenced, over hours or even days. The psychological trauma of witnessing such deaths, so close and yet so unreachable, was immense. The mud also made every task monumentally difficult. Walking was exhausting. Each step required lifting your boot, fighting the mud's grip, struggling to place your foot on solid ground that often didn't exist. A short walk that would take minutes on solid ground took an hour in trench mud. Men arrived at their destinations exhausted before they had done any actual work. Trench foot was the direct result of this constant wetness. When feet remain wet and cold for extended periods, the flesh begins to break down, blood flow decreases, tissue starts to die. The feet swell grotesquely, sometimes doubling in size. The skin turns white, then red, then black as gangrene sets in. Walking becomes agonizing, then impossible. In severe cases, amputation was necessary. Hundreds of thousands of men suffered from trench foot during World War I. British military authorities eventually realized it was preventable with proper foot care, whale oil to protect the skin, regular sock changes, and efforts to keep feet as dry as possible. But in practice, in the front-line trenches where men stood in water for days, prevention was nearly impossible. You couldn't change socks because your spare socks were wet. You couldn't dry your feet because there was no dry place to dry them. You just endured until your feet were damaged, and then you were evacuated to the rear for treatment. Some soldiers welcomed trench foot because it meant a trip to the hospital, time away from the front. Others were accused of deliberately neglecting their feet to cause injury. Courts martial sometimes occurred for soldiers suspected of self-inflicted trench foot. The military drew a fine line between unavoidable injury and perceived malingering, and soldiers suffered the consequences. Then there were the lice. Everyone had lice. Officers, enlisted men, generals when they visited the front. Lice were universal, inescapable, and maddening. They lived in clothing, particularly in the seams where fabric was folded and stitched. They fed on human blood, biting constantly, causing intense itching, and they multiplied with astonishing speed. Soldiers spent hours searching through their uniforms for lice, crushing them between fingernails or burning them with candle flames. This activity, called chatting, was so common it became a standard trench activity. Men would sit in dugouts or quiet sections of trench, examining their shirts seam by seam, finding and killing lice by the dozens. And it made no difference. Within hours, the lice were back, biting, itching, driving men to distraction. Lice weren't just uncomfortable. They spread disease, particularly trench fever, a debilitating illness that caused high fever, severe headaches, and muscle pain so intense that soldiers writhed in agony. Trench fever could last for weeks, leaving men weak and unable to perform their duties. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers contracted it, and there was no cure. You just suffered until it passed. Soldiers tried everything to deal with lice. They ran flames from candles or cigarette lighters along the seams of their clothing, hearing the lice pop. They washed their uniforms when possible, though this rarely helped because lice eggs survived washing. They applied various chemicals and powders, most of which were ineffective. The lice always won. They were a constant, crawling reminder of the filth soldiers lived in, the impossibility of maintaining even basic hygiene. Rats were another plague, not ordinary rats, trench rats, enormous bloated creatures that fed on the dead, on food scraps, on anything they could find. Some were as large as cats, fearless, aggressive, and disgusting. They swarmed through the trenches at night, thousands of them running over sleeping soldiers, stealing food, spreading disease. Soldiers hated the rats with a passion that exceeded their hatred of the enemy. They killed rats whenever possible, shooting them, clubbing them, setting traps. But the rats bred faster than they could be killed. The trenches provided perfect habitat. Endless food from corpses and garbage, shelter in abandoned dugouts and holes in the trench walls, water from shell holes and flooded sections. The rat population exploded and nothing could control it. The rats fed primarily on the dead. No man's land was full of bodies, and it was impossible to retrieve all of them. So the rats fed, growing fat on human flesh, then returning to the trenches, where they'd raid food supplies and attack sleeping soldiers. There are accounts of rats biting men's faces while they slept, of rats so bold they'd snatch food from a soldier's hand, of men waking to find rats crawling over them. The psychological effect was profound. The rats were a constant reminder of death, of decay, of the proximity of corpses. They made the trenches feel even more like a mass grave, which in many ways they were, and they were impossible to ignore, impossible to forget, a living, scurrying manifestation of the horror surrounding the soldiers. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, typhoid, influenza, tuberculosis all spread rapidly in the close, unsanitary conditions. Men lived pressed together, sharing contaminated water, breathing the same air in enclosed dugouts, using latrines that were often just holes in the ground that overflowed regularly. Disease could tear through a unit as effectively as artillery, leaving men weak, feverish, unable to fight. Sanitation was primitive at best. Latrines in the front line. Trenches were simple affairs, just pits dug behind the lines with a wooden seat placed over them. They filled quickly and had to be emptied. A job assigned as punishment duty. Men dug out the waste, carried it away in buckets, and buried it. The smell was indescribable, and the workers often vomited while doing the job. But it had to be done because disease prevention required at least minimal sanitation. Sometimes, during heavy bombardment, men couldn't reach the latrines. They'd use empty tins, buckets, whatever was available, or they'd simply relieve themselves where they stood because survival took precedence over hygiene. The trenches often smelled of human waste mixed with mud, rot, smoke, and death. It was a smell that soldiers could never forget, that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The smell of decay was everywhere. Bodies in no man's land decomposed slowly, particularly in winter when cold slowed the process. But decompose they did, creating a sickly sweet stench that hung over the trenches constantly. After major battles, when no man's land was particularly full of dead, the smell became overwhelming. Men vomited from it. They tried to mask it by smoking constantly, by burning anything that would produce smoke, by breathing through cloth soaked in perfume or antiseptic. Nothing really worked. You just lived with it. Tried to breathe through your mouth, tried not to think about what you were smelling. Gas attacks added another layer of horror to the physical conditions. Chlorine gas was first used in 1915, a greenish-yellow cloud that rolled across no man's land, heavier than air, sinking into trenches and dugouts. It burned lungs, caused choking, blindness, agonizing death. Later gases were even worse. Phosgene killed more slowly, but more certainly. Mustard gas caused horrific blistering, burning skin, and lungs, leaving men blinded and scarred. Gas masks became essential equipment. Early masks were primitive, just cloth pads soaked in chemicals held over the face. They worked poorly and fogged vision. Later masks were more sophisticated, rubber face pieces with glass eye ports and filter canisters, but but they were uncomfortable, claustrophobic, and frightening to wear. Breathing through a gas mask was difficult, leaving men gasping for air, unable to communicate except through gestures. The gas alarm, a loud rattle, gong, or bell, sent men scrambling to don their masks. You had seconds to get the mask on properly or you'd breathe in gas and die. Panic was common. Men fumbled with straps, couldn't get the mask seated correctly, breathed in gas and collapsed choking. Others got their masks on, but then had to function while half blind, unable to communicate, doing tasks that required coordination and clear thinking, while essentially suffocating inside rubber. Gas lingered in low-lying areas, in shell holes and trenches for hours. Men couldn't remove their masks even when the attack seemed over because pockets of gas remained. They sat in their trenches, masked, waiting, listening to the sounds of men who hadn't gotten their masks on in time, dying in the darkness. The psychological effect of gas was as devastating as its physical effects. It created pervasive fear, constant vigilance, the understanding that you could be killed by something invisible and inescapable. Beyond the mud, lice, rats, disease, and gas, there were the wounds, not just from battle, but from the environment itself. Cuts and scrapes became infected immediately in the filth of the trenches. Bacteria from the soil, contaminated with manure, human waste, and decaying organic matter, caused terrible infections. Tetanus was common. Gas gangrene, a rapidly spreading infection that turned tissue black and killed within days, was a constant threat. Small wounds that in clean conditions would heal quickly became life-threatening in the trenches. A minor cut on a hand could lead to blood poisoning that required amputation. Men learned to treat even tiny injuries seriously, applying antiseptics, bandaging carefully, trying to keep wounds clean in an environment where cleanliness was impossible. Soldiers also suffered from exposure to the elements. Frostbite in winter destroyed fingers, toes, ears, noses. Summer brought heat stroke and dehydration. Spring and autumn brought the rain, endless rain that filled trenches, collapsed walls, and kept everything perpetually wet. Men suffered from chronic colds, coughs, respiratory infections. They never fully recovered because they never had the chance to properly rest and recuperate in clean, dry, warm conditions. The constant physical misery wore men down psychologically. It's one thing to endure hardship if you believe it's temporary, that conditions will improve, that relief is coming. But in the trenches, conditions never improved. Tomorrow would be just as miserable as today. Next week would bring the same mud, the same lice, the same rats, the same discomfort. There was no escape, no end in sight, just the grinding continuation of misery that eventually broke men's spirits as effectively as shellfire broke their bodies. Living in these conditions required a kind of psychological adaptation. Soldiers learned to normalize the abnormal, to accept as routine things that would have been unthinkable in civilian life. Sleeping next to decomposing bodies, eating food contaminated with dirt and insects, functioning while covered in lice and standing in filth. It was a form of survival, a way to maintain sanity in insane conditions. But it left scars that never fully healed. Between the routine and the misery, there was boredom. Crushing, mind-numbing, soul-destroying boredom. This might seem contradictory. How could soldiers be bored while living in constant danger, while surrounded by death? But boredom and terror coexisted in the trenches. Long stretches of nothing happening, punctuated by brief moments of absolute horror. Most of a soldier's time was spent waiting for attacks that might never come, waiting for orders that might never arrive, waiting for the war to end, just waiting. Soldiers couldn't read much, because light attracted sniper fire and most dugouts were too dark. They couldn't move around freely because the trenches were crowded and movement attracted attention. They couldn't pursue hobbies or entertainment that required space or resources. So they sat, they talked, they thought, they went slowly mad from the monotony. Talking helped pass the time, and soldiers talked endlessly about home, about food they missed, about girlfriends, wives, families, about plans for after the war, assuming they survived. These conversations were repetitive, covering the same ground over and over, but they were human connection, a way to maintain some sense of normalcy. They also complained. Soldiers have always complained, and World War I soldiers complained prodigiously about the food, the officers, the conditions, the stupidity of orders, the seeming endlessness of the war. Complaining was a form of resistance, a way to assert some control over their situation. It was therapy, allowing men to vent frustrations that otherwise had no outlet. Gambling was popular when men had money and weren't too tired. Card games, dice games, impromptu wagers on anything that could be bet on. Gambling helped pass time and offered the possibility, however remote, of winning something, of luck improving your situation. It also created a sense of agency, of making choices and influencing outcomes, which was psychologically important for men who otherwise had no control over their lives. Soldiers wrote letters constantly. Writing was a link to the outside world, a way to maintain identity as something more than just a soldier. Men wrote to parents, spouses, siblings, friends. They wrote about their experiences, though always carefully because of censorship. They wrote about their feelings, their fears, their hopes. They wrote to maintain the fiction that they were still the same people they'd been before the war, that somehow they'd return unchanged. Some men read. Books and newspapers from home were treasured possessions, passed around until they fell apart. The content almost didn't matter. Reading was escape, a way to occupy the mind with something other than the immediate misery. Religious soldiers read Bibles, others read novels, poetry, anything they could get. The British Army distributed small volumes of classic literature, fitting in a soldier's pocket, and these were read and reread until memorized. Soldiers also created art. Some carved wood, creating small sculptures or useful items from scraps of timber. Others drew, sketching scenes from trench life, portraits of comrades, images of home they carried in their minds. A few wrote poetry, trying to capture in words the experience they were living through, creating some of the most powerful war poetry in English literature. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Rupert Brooke, all were soldiers who wrote while in the trenches, trying to make sense of senselessness. Music helped. Soldiers sang individually and in groups. They sang songs from home, patriotic songs, body songs, newly composed songs about trench life. Some units had harmonicas, accordions, or other small instruments that had been brought from home or sent in care packages. Music provided emotional release, a way to express feelings that couldn't be spoken. It also created group cohesion, binding men together in shared experience. When possible, men played games. Football was popular among British soldiers. They'd kick a ball around in cleared areas behind the lines, organizing matches between units. It was physical activity, competition, normalcy. It reminded them they were young men who should be playing games, not fighting wars. Other games were improvised, throwing competitions, races, anything to break the monotony. Religion offered solace to some. Chaplains served in the trenches, holding services when possible, offering spiritual counsel, administering last rites to the dying. Many soldiers prayed, finding comfort in faith. Others lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile a benevolent God with the horror surrounding them. But religious observance, whether deeply felt or simply habitual, provided structure and familiar ritual. Soldiers also slept whenever possible. Sleep was escape, the only guaranteed way to not be conscious of the misery. Men became expert at sleeping under conditions that should have made sleep impossible. They slept sitting up, standing if necessary, through shellfire and noise, for brief minutes snatched between duties. Sleep deprivation was constant, and men learned to function on a few hours of broken sleep, supplemented by brief naps whenever opportunity allowed. But despite all these activities, despite the attempts to stay occupied, the boredom remained, because nothing they did changed their situation. They were still trapped in the trenches, still surrounded by mud and death, still facing the probability of being killed. The activities were distraction, not solution. They helped pass time, but didn't make the time meaningful. The boredom led to strange behaviors. Soldiers took irrational risks just to feel something other than monotony. They'd stand on the fire step during the day, exposing themselves to snipers, just to see if they could spot enemy movement. They'd volunteer for dangerous assignments, raids, patrols, not out of bravery, but out of desperate need for something to happen. They'd deliberately provoke enemy fire by showing themselves or making noise, then take cover and feel a strange satisfaction that at least something had occurred. This risk-taking was so common that officers had to actively discourage it, posting guards to prevent soldiers from doing stupid things out of boredom. But you can't really prevent it. Men will find ways to create stimulation when none exists, even if that stimulation might kill them. The worst aspect of the boredom was the sense of wasted time. These were mostly young men in their 20s, the age when life should be rich with possibility, with adventure, with the future opening before them. Instead, they sat in holes in the ground, waiting. Weeks became months, months became years. Their youth was being consumed by waiting, by boredom, by the absence of life. Even soldiers who survived physically lost those years irretrievably. The time was just gone, burned up in the trenches, with nothing to show for it but memories of misery. The boredom also created a strange relationship with the enemy. British soldiers called German soldiers Fritz or Jerry. Germans called British soldiers Tommy. French called Germans Bosch. These weren't terms of respect exactly, but they weren't pure hatred either. They were almost familiar, acknowledging that the enemy soldiers were human beings caught in the same miserable situation. During quiet periods, an unofficial live and let live system often developed. If the enemy didn't shoot at you during breakfast, you didn't shoot at them. If they didn't shell your trenches, you didn't shell theirs. This wasn't official policy, it was spontaneous, arising from the shared understanding that making each other's lives more miserable than they already were served no purpose. Officers tried to stop this fraternization, ordering aggressive patrolling and random shooting to maintain hostility. Because the military brass understood something important. If soldiers saw the enemy as human, if they developed sympathy, they might refuse to fight when ordered. The hate had to be maintained artificially because the natural human instinct, when you're not actively being shot at, is not to shoot. The most famous example of this was the Christmas truce of 1914, when British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, sang carols, and played football. It was spontaneous, unauthorized, and deeply threatening to military authorities who worked hard to make sure it never happened again. Because that truce demonstrated that soldiers, left to their own devices, would rather not kill each other. The boredom and routine created a strange kind of normalization. This hellish existence became normal. Men adapted, psychologically and physically. They learned to sleep through shell fire. They learned to eat contaminated food without thinking about it. They learned to step over bodies without flinching. They learned to function in conditions that should have been unendurable. This adaptation was necessary for survival, but it came at a cost. The things they learned to accept, to normalize, were fundamentally abnormal, inhuman. And when the war ended and survivors returned home, they carried that normalization with them. They'd been changed at a fundamental level, adapted to a world of horror in ways that made civilian life seem strange, incomprehensible, almost unreal. The boredom between moments of terror created a unique psychological profile in trench soldiers. They weren't constantly terrified, which would have been unbearable. They weren't constantly engaged, which would have been exhausting. They existed in a strange liminal state, neither fully relaxed nor fully alert, waiting for violence, but usually experiencing boredom. It was psychologically destabilizing in ways that more constant combat might not have been. At least in constant combat, you're engaged. In the trenches, you just waited. Of all the aspects of trench warfare, the violence when it came was perhaps the most psychologically devastating, precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the boredom that preceded it. Men could go days or even weeks without seeing significant combat, lulled into a routine where death remained a possibility but seemed somehow distant. And then, suddenly, a major attack would begin, and the world would explode into chaos. Artillery bombardments were the most common form of violence, and they were terrible beyond description. Shells screamed overhead constantly during bombardments, thousands of them. The noise so loud it destroyed hearing, made thinking impossible, reduced men to cowering animals trying to survive. The shells came in different sizes. Light shells that made sharp, cracking explosions. Medium shells that sent up geysers of dirt and debris. Heavy shells, monsters weighing hundreds of pounds, that created craters large enough to swallow a house, that sent shockwaves powerful enough to kill without direct hits, that simply erased anything near the impact point. The psychological effect of bombardment was cumulative and devastating. The first shells were terrifying, sending men diving for cover, hearts racing, breath coming in gasps. But as the bombardment continued hour after hour, sometimes for days during major offensives, terror gave way to something else. A kind of numb resignation. Men huddled in dugouts, pressed against each other, feeling the earth shake with each impact, breathing dust and smoke, waiting to die. There was nothing you could do during a bombardment except endure. You couldn't shoot back, you couldn't run, you couldn't fight. You just waited and hoped the next shell wouldn't be the one with your name on it. This passivity, this helplessness, was psychologically destroying. Men needed to feel they could fight back, could influence their fate. But against artillery, they were completely powerless. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was the direct result of this experience. Men broke under prolonged bombardment. They became catatonic, unable to speak or move. They trembled uncontrollably. They lost their minds, running screaming into no man's land or attacking their own officers. Shell shock affected hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and military authorities initially didn't understand it, or didn't want to understand it. Early in the war, shell-shocked soldiers were often accused of cowardice, of faking injury to avoid duty. Some were court-martialed and executed for desertion or cowardice, when they were actually suffering from what we now recognize as severe psychological trauma. Officers ordered shell-shocked soldiers back to the front, believing that showing weakness would encourage others to malinger. Medical understanding was primitive. Shell shock was thought to be physical, caused by concussion from shells, and doctors looked for physical injuries that didn't exist. Gradually, understanding improved. Doctors realized shell shock was psychological, not physical. Treatment facilities were established behind the lines where shell-shocked soldiers could rest, receive therapy of a sort, and hopefully recover enough to return to duty. But the stigma remained. Men suffering from shell shock felt ashamed, believing they'd failed, that they were weak, that they should be able to endure what their comrades endured. The reality was that everyone had a breaking point. No one was immune. Young, healthy, courageous men broke just as quickly as anyone else when subjected to sufficient stress. Shell shock was the mind's way of protecting itself from trauma it couldn't process, shutting down to prevent total collapse. But military culture couldn't accept this. It threatened the foundation of military discipline, which required men to endure the unendurable without breaking. Going over the top, attacking across no man's land, was the other major form of violence. And it was arguably worse than bombardment because it required action, required men to run toward enemy positions while being shot at, while their friends were being killed around them, while every instinct screamed at them to take cover. Attacks followed a pattern. First came a bombardment of enemy trenches, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes days. The artillery was supposed to destroy enemy defenses, cut wire, kill defenders. In practice, it often accomplished little. The Germans built deep dugouts that were nearly shell-proof. Their wire was dense and well-constructed. Bombardments warned the enemy that an attack was coming, allowing them to bring up reserves and prepare. When the bombardment lifted, the infantry went over the top. Officers blew whistles. Men climbed ladders onto the fire step, pulled themselves over the parapet and started across no man's land. They were supposed to walk, not run, maintaining formation, covering ground steadily. This was doctrine based on the belief that running would tire men before they reached enemy lines, that maintaining formation was necessary for coordinated attack. In practice, doctrine was insane. Walking across no man's land, where German machine guns had clear fields of fire, was suicide. The Germans, sheltered in their deep dugouts during the bombardment, would emerge as soon as it lifted, set up their machine guns, and open fire. The attackers had no cover. They walked into a hail of bullets that cut them down in rows. The machine gun was the defining weapon of World War I. It could fire 500 rounds per minute, accurate to 1,000 yards. A single machine gun, properly positioned, could stop an entire battalion. The Germans had excellent machine guns, well positioned, with interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. British and French attacks walked into this fire and were slaughtered. The casualties were staggering. On the first day of the Somme offensive, July 1st, 1916, the British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead, in a single day. Most fell in the first hour, cut down by machine guns before they'd even reached German wire. Units ceased to exist. Entire battalions were wiped out. The attacks continued anyway, day after day, for months, achieving minimal gains at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. For the soldiers, attacking was a nightmare. You climbed out of the trench knowing you'd probably die. You watched friends fall around you, torn apart by bullets, screaming, bleeding, dying in the mud. You kept going because orders said to go, because officers behind you would shoot you if you refused, because your friends were going and you couldn't abandon them. And if you survived the crossing, if you somehow made it to the enemy trench, then came the close quarters fighting, trench raids, and the hand-to-hand combat that occurred when attackers actually reached enemy trenches were brutal in ways that distance combat wasn't. Men fought with bayonets, clubs, entrenching tools, knives, anything that could kill. It was personal, face-to-face, visceral. You saw the enemy's eyes, you smelled his breath. You felt his blood spray when you stabbed or bludgeoned him. Bayonet fighting was taught extensively in training, but in practice it was rare. Men preferred to shoot. But when ammunition ran out, or in the chaos of fighting through narrow trenches, bayonets were used. Stabbing another human being is psychologically difficult. Training tried to overcome this reluctance, but many soldiers couldn't do it, couldn't force the blade into flesh even when their own lives depended on it. Those who could kill in close combat were often traumatized by it. They remembered specific kills, specific faces, for the rest of their lives. The impersonality of firing a rifle at distant targets was psychologically easier to process. You pulled a trigger, someone far away fell. You didn't see their face, didn't make eye contact, didn't feel their death intimately. But in a trench, fighting hand to hand, killing was immediate, personal, impossible to rationalize away. Soldiers also threw grenades, bombs that exploded with devastating effect in the confined spaces of trenches. Early grenades were primitive, unreliable, as dangerous to the thrower as the target. But they improved rapidly, becoming highly effective weapons for clearing dugouts and trenches. Grenade throwing required getting close to enemy positions, exposing yourself, and hoping you could throw accurately and take cover before the explosion. Flamethrowers were used occasionally, particularly by Germans. They were terrifying weapons, shooting streams of burning liquid that incinerated anything they touched. Men caught by flamethrowers didn't die quickly. They burned, screaming, running in panic, spreading fire to anything nearby. The psychological effect on defenders was devastating. The sight of a flamethrower team advancing could cause panic and retreat even among experienced troops. Chemical weapons, as mentioned earlier, were another form of violence, invisible and inescapable. Gas attacks could kill hundreds or thousands in minutes. Even soldiers who survived often suffered permanent injuries, damaged lungs, destroyed eyesight, chemical burns that never fully healed. The violence was also random. A soldier could do everything right, follow every procedure, take every precaution, and still die from a random shell that happened to land on his dugout, or a sniper's bullet that found the one moment he lifted his head above the parapet, or gas that drifted into his section of trench. There was no fairness, no justice, no correlation between skill and survival. Luck mattered more than anything. This randomness was perhaps the hardest thing to accept. If survival depended on skill or courage, soldiers could believe they had some control over their fate, but it didn't. You could be brave and skilled and still die. You could be cowardly and incompetent and survive. The universe didn't care. Shells fell where they fell. Bullets went where they went. Your death or survival was essentially random. Soldiers developed fatalism as a coping mechanism. If your number was up, you'd die. If it wasn't, you'd survive. No point worrying about it. This fatalism was psychologically protective, allowing men to function without being paralyzed by fear. But it also reflected a deep despair, a surrender to forces beyond control, an acceptance that their lives had no inherent value or meaning. The aftermath of violence was its own horror. Caring for the wounded, seeing friends with terrible injuries, watching men die slowly from wounds that couldn't be treated. Medical care in the trenches was primitive. Stretcher bearers would carry wounded back through communication trenches, often under fire, to aid stations where doctors did what they could. But major injuries, abdominal wounds, head wounds, severe burns were often fatal. Medicine couldn't save them. Morphine was used heavily for pain relief, but supplies were often inadequate. Men died in agony, screaming for help that couldn't come, for mothers, for God, for someone to end their suffering. Other soldiers watched, listened, tried to help, and were haunted by their helplessness. Burial details handled the dead, gathering bodies, often in pieces, taking them to mass graves behind the lines. Identifying the dead was difficult. Many bodies were too damaged. Dog tags helped when they were present and legible. But many dead were never identified, never properly buried, just listed as missing and forgotten. The violence created bonds between survivors. Men who'd fought together, who'd survived the same attacks, developed connections deeper than peacetime friendships. They'd shared the most intense experiences possible, had depended on each other for survival, had seen each other at their worst and best. These bonds lasted lifetimes, but the violence also isolated soldiers from everyone who hadn't experienced it. How could you explain what combat was like to someone who'd never been there? How could you convey the terror, the chaos, the helplessness, the random death? You couldn't. So soldiers stopped trying. They kept their experiences to themselves, sharing them only with other veterans who already understood. This silence, this inability or unwillingness to speak about their experiences affected soldiers for the rest of their lives. They carried the memories alone, unable to share the burden, unable to process the trauma. It contributed to depression, alcoholism, suicide, all the ways traumatized people try to cope with pain they can't express. The violence of World War I was industrial, mechanized, impersonal, and yet intensely personal. It killed on an unprecedented scale while creating intimate, individual traumas. It was modern warfare in its most terrible form, and the men who endured it were broken by it in ways that previous generations of soldiers hadn't been. The sheer scale of the killing, the apparent meaninglessness of the suffering, the grinding, continuous nature of the combat, all combined to create psychological damage that lasted generations. Amid all the horror, soldiers found ways to be human, to maintain dignity, to care for each other, to create moments of joy, or at least relief from suffering. Camaraderie wasn't just important, it was essential, the only thing that made survival psychologically possible. Men formed tight bonds with their fellow soldiers, particularly with the men in their immediate unit, your section, your squad. These were the men you lived with, fought with, depended on absolutely. They became family, often closer than actual family, because they shared experiences your real family could never understand. Soldiers looked after each other in countless small ways, sharing food when rations were short, giving up a dry spot to sleep so a friend could rest, carrying a wounded comrade to safety, even when doing so meant risking your own life. Writing letters home for men who couldn't write, reading letters aloud for men who couldn't read. These acts of kindness, small in themselves, were profound in the context of the trenches. Officers who earned their men's respect did so by sharing their hardships, by not asking soldiers to do anything they wouldn't do themselves, by showing genuine concern for their men's welfare. Good officers knew their soldiers' names, their backgrounds, their families. They checked on the sick and wounded. They made sure their men were fed, rested, and equipped as well as possible. They stood with their men during attacks instead of hanging back. Bad officers, those who prioritized their own comfort, who shirked danger, who treated their men like disposable resources, were despised. In some cases, they were killed by their own soldiers, shot during attacks when bullets were flying and no one could prove who'd fired. This was rare, but not unknown. The bonds between soldiers were stronger than the bonds between soldiers and incompetent or cruel officers. Soldiers also created rituals and traditions that gave structure and meaning to trench life. Units developed their own songs, their own slang, their own ways of doing things. They celebrated holidays and birthdays as best they could. They honored the dead with makeshift memorials, simple crosses, or cairns of stones marking places where men had fallen. Mail from home was communal in a sense. When a man received a care package with food or treats, he shared with his friends. When someone received news, good or bad, His comrades celebrated or mourned with him. The boundaries between individuals blurred. You weren't just yourself, you were part of a unit, a collective, and everyone's welfare was everyone's concern. Soldiers developed dark humor, joking about death, about the absurdities of military life, about the incompetence of officers, about the futility of the war. This humor wasn't about making light of suffering. It was a coping mechanism, a way to assert control over circumstances you couldn't control. If you could joke about death, you could face it. If you could laugh at the absurdity, you could endure it. They also told stories, creating an oral tradition that passed down knowledge, warned about dangers, and kept alive the memories of men who died. These stories were often exaggerated, made more dramatic in the telling, but they served important purposes. They taught lessons, they memorialized the dead, they created shared history that bound units together. Physical contact was common and accepted in ways that would have seemed strange in peacetime. Men slept pressed together for warmth. They touched each other constantly, a hand on a shoulder, an arm around a friend. Physical reassurance that they weren't alone. This wasn't sexual. It was human need for connection, for touch, for physical evidence that other people existed and cared. Crying was accepted. Men cried for dead friends, from exhaustion, from fear, from despair. No one mocked them. Everyone understood. The stiff upper lip, the British ideal of emotional restraint, broke down in the trenches. You couldn't maintain that facade when everything around you was falling apart. Soldiers also practiced small acts of beauty and creation amid the destruction. They carved wooden items, made jewelry from shell casings, drew pictures, wrote poetry. These acts asserted that humanity persisted, that soldiers were more than just killing machines, that beauty could exist even in hell. Religion brought comfort to many, though faith was tested severely. Some soldiers found their faith strengthened by the trials they endured. Others lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with the horror of the trenches. Chaplains worked tirelessly, holding services, offering counsel, comforting the dying, burying the dead. They were respected figures, even by non-believers, because they shared the soldiers' hardships and genuinely cared. Acts of mercy toward the enemy also occurred, though they were officially discouraged. British and German soldiers sometimes helped each other's wounded who were lying in no man's land. They'd call informal truces to allow stretcher bearers to collect injured men. They'd refrain from shooting men who were obviously wounded or evacuating casualties. These moments of shared humanity, recognizing the enemy as human beings rather than targets, were psychologically important. They proved that civilization hadn't been entirely destroyed, that compassion could survive even in these conditions. Soldiers on both sides also left food, cigarettes, or other small items for enemy patrols to find, almost like gifts. These were gestures of respect, acknowledgements that the men in the opposite trench were suffering too, that despite being enemies, there was a strange kinship in shared misery. The live and let live system mentioned earlier was another form of humanity. During quiet periods, unofficial agreements developed. Morning stand to would be noisy, but no one actually fired at each other. Certain times were understood to be safe for bathing or cooking. Snipers would deliberately miss. This cooperation was fragile and could be shattered instantly by orders from higher command or by new aggressive units rotating in. But while it lasted, it made life slightly more bearable. Veterans often spoke later about the comradeship as the best part of their experience, the only good thing to come from the war. They'd found friendship, loyalty, and love in the trenches that they'd never found in civilian life. Men who otherwise would never have met formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. This wasn't romanticizing the war, it was acknowledging that amid unimaginable horror, human connection thrived. Reunions after the war were emotional affairs. Veterans would travel to meet former comrades, to remember together, to share their continued grief and trauma with the only people who truly understood. They formed veterans associations, clubs, groups that met regularly and maintained the bonds forged in the trenches. Many veterans felt alienated from civilian society after the war, but deeply connected to other veterans. Only veterans understood. Only they had been there. Only they could comprehend what had been endured. This created a lifelong division between those who'd served and those who hadn't, a gulf of experience that could never be fully bridged. The camaraderie, the human connections formed in the trenches were perhaps the one purely good thing to emerge from World War I. Everything else, the technological advances, the political changes, the social transformations, was tainted by the cost. But the bonds between soldiers, the genuine love and loyalty they developed, that was real and true. It didn't justify the war. Nothing could justify the war, but it demonstrated that even in the worst circumstances, humans can care for each other, support each other, and find meaning in connection. After days, weeks, or sometimes months in the frontline trenches, units were rotated to the rear for rest and recovery. These rest periods were desperately needed, brief respites from the immediate danger and misery of the trenches. But they weren't vacations. Rest meant relative safety, but it didn't mean actual rest in any meaningful sense. Units moved back through the communication trenches to support and reserve positions first, then farther back to rear areas miles behind the front. The journey was exhausting. Long marches through mud, carrying full equipment, often at night. Men stumbled along half asleep, numb with exhaustion, just trying to reach their destination without collapsing. Once in rest areas, the first priority was cleaning up. Soldiers were covered in mud, lice, and the accumulated filth of weeks in the trenches. They were given opportunities to bathe, usually in improvised facilities, large tubs or pools, where men washed away the worst of the dirt. It wasn't luxurious. The water was often cold. The soap was harsh, but it was transformative, washing away not just physical dirt, but some of the psychological weight of the trenches. Clean clothes were issued, or at least soldiers could wash their existing clothes and try to delouse them. Uniforms were boiled to kill lice, though this was only partially effective. Men ran candles along seams, burning eggs and adults. They hung clothes in the sun. They tried everything, but the lice always returned once. They went back to the trenches. Medical care was provided in rest areas. Doctors examined soldiers, treating minor ailments that had been ignored in the trenches. Trench foot was dressed, infected cuts were cleaned, men were checked for diseases. Those too sick or injured to return to duty were sent to hospitals farther in the rear. Food improved in rest areas. Hot meals were more regular. The quality was better, though still institutional military food. But after weeks of cold bully beef and hard biscuits, even mediocre hot food felt like a feast. Soldiers ate ravenously, making up for weeks of inadequate rations. Sleep was the most valued commodity. Actual beds, or at least dry places to lie down, were luxuries beyond description. Soldiers slept for hours, sometimes days, catching up on weeks of sleep deprivation. They slept without nightmares for the first time, exhausted enough that even trauma couldn't wake them. But rest periods weren't entirely restful. Training continued. Soldiers drilled, practiced attacks, reviewed tactics. Military authorities believed that keeping men busy prevented them from dwelling on their experiences and maintained discipline. So even in rest areas, there were inspections, drills, work details. Entertainment was provided, though it was limited. The military organized concerts, brought in performers from home, showed films if projection equipment was available. These entertainments were appreciated, moments of normalcy and joy. Soldiers laughed, applauded, forgot for brief periods where they were and what they'd have to return to. Soldiers also went to nearby towns and villages when possible, visiting cafes, estaminets, any place where they could buy wine, beer, or food. They interacted with civilians, flirted with local women, tried to feel human again. These interactions were complicated. Civilians couldn't really understand what soldiers had experienced. Their concerns seemed trivial to men who'd been living in trenches. But the attempt at connection was psychologically important. Prostitution was common in towns near rest areas. Soldiers, young men who might die any day, sought physical connection, escape, or just human touch. Military authorities officially disapproved, but tacitly accepted prostitution as inevitable. They set up medical inspections to try controlling venereal disease, which was rampant. Mail arrived regularly in rest areas, and soldiers could write letters without worrying about light-attracting shells. They wrote long letters home, trying to explain what they'd experienced without causing their families to worry excessively. They wrote with a strange disconnect, describing conditions that should have been unimaginable in casual terms because they had become normal. Some soldiers used rest periods to process their trauma, talking with chaplains or medical personnel. Others suppressed everything, refusing to think about or discuss their experiences. They drank heavily, trying to numb themselves, to forget. Alcoholism was common, a coping mechanism that often persisted after the war. Athletes organized sports, particularly football. Matches between units were popular both for participants and spectators. Physical activity helped burn off nervous energy and provided structured competition that felt safe and controlled compared to combat. But underlying everything in rest areas was the knowledge that it was temporary. Everyone knew they'd have to go back. The trenches waited. The war continued. Rest was just a pause, a brief reprieve, before returning to the front line and resuming the miserable routine. The psychological impact of this cycle, trenches to rest and back to trenches, was significant. It prevented soldiers from ever fully adjusting to either environment. They couldn't settle into trench life because rest periods offered hope of escape. They couldn't settle into rest because they knew it would end. They existed in a state of perpetual transition, never quite present anywhere, always dreading the next rotation forward. As rest periods ended, soldiers prepared to return to the front. Equipment was inspected and repaired. Supplies were issued. Men wrote what might be final letters home. They said goodbye to friends who were being sent to different sectors. They steeled themselves mentally for the return to misery. The march back to the front was psychologically devastating. Each step took them closer to danger. The sounds of artillery grew louder. The devastation became visible. The smell of the trenches reached them while still miles away. Men walked in silence, each alone with his thoughts, contemplating the probability of death. And then they were back in the trenches, and the cycle began again. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. For some soldiers, for most soldiers, the war became their entire reality. They couldn't remember clearly what life had been like before. They couldn't imagine life after. There was just the trench, the routine, the waiting, and the knowledge that eventually, probably, they would die here. The rotation system meant that soldiers experienced the war in cycles of misery and brief relief, never escaping entirely, never able to put it behind them until the war ended, or they were wounded seriously enough to be sent home permanently. This cyclical experience created a kind of traumatic repetition that was psychologically damaging in unique ways. You couldn't adjust, you couldn't heal, you just cycled through, surviving each rotation, accumulating more trauma each time. When the war finally ended on November 11th, 1918, soldiers in the trenches heard the news with disbelief. The fighting stopped at 11 o'clock that morning. Suddenly, after 4 years, silence. No shells, no machine guns, no attacks, just silence. Some men cheered, others cried. Many just sat, stunned, unable to process that it was actually over. The immediate aftermath was strange. Soldiers remained in their positions initially, unsure what to do. Eventually, they climbed out of the trenches and walked around no man's land, this space that had been deadly for years, now suddenly safe. They met enemy soldiers, shook hands, traded souvenirs. The hate that had been manufactured and maintained dissolved quickly once the shooting stopped. But the return to civilian life was extraordinarily difficult for survivors. They'd been changed fundamentally by their experiences. The men who came home were not the men who'd left. They'd seen things, done things, endured things that separated them permanently from those who'd stayed home. Many veterans struggled with what we now call PTSD. Nightmares plagued them, loud noises triggered panic. They couldn't adjust to civilian employment, couldn't settle into peacetime routines. The intensity of trench warfare had recalibrated their nervous systems. Normal life felt boring, meaningless, incomprehensible. Some veterans became alcoholics, trying to numb the memories. Some committed suicide, unable to live with their trauma. Some became violent, their wartime experiences having broken internal inhibitions against violence. Many simply struggled quietly, trying to fit into a society that didn't understand them and didn't really want to hear about their experiences. Families welcomed soldiers home but found strangers wearing familiar faces. Wives didn't recognize their husbands. Children were frightened of fathers they barely remembered. The soldiers tried to explain, but couldn't. How do you describe years of living in mud and death to people whose biggest concern was whether the grocer had raised prices? The lost generation, as they came to be called, struggled to find meaning in civilian life after the all-consuming experience of the war. Many felt they'd left the best parts of themselves in the trenches, buried with dead friends. They went through the motions of living without ever feeling fully alive again. Physically, many were damaged, lung diseases from gas, missing limbs from wounds, damaged hearing from artillery, chronic pain from old injuries that never healed properly. They were old men in young bodies, worn out by experiences that should never have happened. The daily life of a World War I soldier was, in the end, a study in endurance. Not the dramatic, heroic endurance of withstanding an attack, though that happened too, but the quiet, grinding endurance of surviving day after day in conditions designed to break you, of getting up each morning knowing you faced another day of mud, lice, cold, boredom, and probable death, of doing the work anyway, of maintaining your humanity anyway, of caring for your friends anyway, of refusing to give up even when every rational calculation said giving up made sense. The daily routine, the physical misery, the violence, the camaraderie, all of it combined to create an experience unlike any in human history. World War I wasn't just fought in the big battles. The Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele. It was fought every single day by millions of men doing their best to survive in an impossible situation. They weren't all heroes. Most were just ordinary men doing what they were told, trying to get through, hoping to survive and go home. But their collective endurance, their refusal to break despite everything, that was heroic in its own way. Not the heroism of charging machine guns, though some did that, but the heroism of waking up each morning in a wet, cold trench full of rats and lice, knowing the day would be miserable and getting up anyway, of doing your duty anyway, of staying human anyway. This is the story that's often lost in accounts of World War I, the daily reality, the boring bits, the unglamorous survival, the stubborn endurance. It's not exciting. It doesn't make for dramatic cinema. But it's the truth. And understanding this truth helps us understand not just World War I, but war itself, the ways it breaks people, the ways people endure anyway, and the tremendous cost of that endurance. The soldiers of World War I deserve to be remembered, not just for the battles they fought, but for the days they survived, for the mornings they woke up despite wanting to stay asleep forever, for the meals they choked down despite having no appetite, for the letters they wrote despite having nothing hopeful to say, for the friends they mourned despite having no time to grieve, for the humanity they maintained despite everything conspiring to strip it away. They endured. That's the story. They endured the unendurable, and somehow many of them survived, broken, traumatized, forever changed, but alive. And that endurance, that stubborn, unglamorous daily survival, that deserves remembering. Not because it glorifies war, it doesn't. It shows war for what it truly is, but because it shows what humans can endure when they have no choice, what they can survive when surrender isn't an option, and how even in the worst circumstances, imaginable connection, compassion, and humanity can persist. This was daily life for a World War I soldier. Not glorious, not romantic, not the stuff of legends, just endurance, day after day, until finally, mercifully, it ended.